Well, good afternoon, everybody. And after lots and lots of these messages from me where I bemoan what's happening, the last 5 days, at least for me, have been like Christmas in April. I've had 3 of my top priorities that I've worked on, each of them for, in some cases, more than a year, all get signed by the president. The reauthorization of Section 702 in our intelligence bill that was passed by the Senate on Friday night. And of course, last night, the assistance to Ukraine and the movement on a divestiture on TikTok. And let me try to hit at least the Ukraine and the TikTok items at the top. While this should not have taken 6 months, the fact that we had close to 80% of the House and 80% of the Senate overwhelmingly say that America was not going to retreat, not become isolationist, and stand by our allies in Ukraine sends a strong message not only to Vladimir Putin, but to authoritarian regimes in China, in Iran, in North Korea, and elsewhere, that America will stand strong and we will stand by our commitments. We've seen the Ukrainians over the last couple of years, as I told you, beat back the Russians repeatedly. 87% of Russian pre-existing ground forces have been eliminated from the battlefield, 63% of their tanks, 32% of their armored personnel carriers, at a cost to the United States of less than 3% of our defense spending, and without the loss of a single American soldier's life. This additional $60 billion in economic and military aid, and the military aid, about 90 cents on every dollar, will actually be spent right here in America, where we produce the munitions that will go to our Ukrainian friends, is extraordinarily important. I think it is as important as what happened in advance of World War II, when then British Prime Minister Chamberlain basically acceded to Adolf Hitler's demands in Munich. We could have had that same kind of giving in to authoritarianism if we'd walked away. So today, I think the world is safer. I think our friends in Ukraine are safer. I think NATO is stronger. And I think we have, it was an enormously important step. In that bill as well, there is assistance for Taiwan, and also trying to make sure that President Xi does not take a page from Putin and try to move into Taiwan, as well as necessary military aid to Israel and humanitarian aid to the unfortunate fact that now over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza conflict. And while it's important that we get these arms to Israel, I hope Israel will also bear in mind, just a week ago when we saw Iran launch missiles against Israel. Yes, it was Israel that took down a lot of those missiles. Yes, it was American assistance, but it was also British assistance, French assistance, Jordanian assistance, and Saudi Arabian assistance helping Israel. Israel's stronger when it has allies. The only way it will keep allies is if we can bring this conflict in Gaza to an end, get the hostages returned, and end the bloodshed. So I think this additional assistance there was critically important. And then finally, obviously TikTok. It's been over a year, and I think the heavy-handed tactics that TikTok used, perhaps successfully, against my initial bipartisan bill, the Restrict Act, while they were successful a year ago, the same heavy-handed tactics have not been successful in this round. Again, close to 80%, over 80% of the House and close to 80% of the Senate said TikTok needs to be divested from its control by its Chinese ownership. As I've said many times here, the Chinese law dictates that Chinese companies, their top priority is not shareholders or their customers. It is the Communist Party of China. And this entity, while enormously popular, 170 million Americans, average 90 minutes a day, the idea that they are collecting this kind of data, or potentially TikTok could be used as a propaganda tool, is enormously troubling. And as I said repeatedly, don't take my word for it. Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, said it's a national security concern. Virtually all of our intelligence community has said so. And every other major democracy in the world, in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, have all prohibited TikTok from their governmental devices. And the vast majority of major news organizations have said to their journalists, don't use TikTok, or chances are you could be surveilled by Chinese sources. And I think, again, over the year, we've seen lots of stories from disgruntled former TikTok employees indicating that ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, the Chinese company, continues to interfere. So I think this was a strong step forward. I hope now with a year time that we can have this transaction take place. As I've said before, a lot of creativity on TikTok. Folks make money off of it as social influencers. I got no problem with that. Just at the end of the day, the entity that controls the algorithm and that is potentially collecting the data ought to be not a national adversary of the United States in terms of the Chinese Communist Party. So I would be happy to help and ease in terms of these divestiture efforts, and I know people have already indicated interest in purchasing the company so that the kind of creativity can continue. Again, long week, a lot of late nights. I'm a little rusty in terms of, again, the late night last night. But with that, why don't I go ahead and go to Laura? I know there's lots of questions.
COP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks a lot for joining us. Question related to TikTok. As you're well aware, TikTok has threatened to go to court. In fact, the CEO of TikTok went on TikTok to announce that they were going to do that. India, a few years ago, successfully took away TikTok in that country, but I believe that TikTok did not go to court. How do you see this moving forward, since it's obviously going to take quite a while before a lot of these pieces fall together?
Well, again, India prohibited consumer use of TikTok in 2020. They have a different set of legal system, obviously. They don't have nearly as strong a First Amendment guarantees as we do in this country. And in a perfect world, I think the approach that my bill took a year ago, the Restrict Act, which had 26 bipartisan co-sponsors, which was a more systemic approach to foreign-based technology in America that would pose national security concerns. But we didn't go that way. The House bill that the Senate adopted, one of the things that I worked on and Senator Cantwell worked on, the chair of the Commerce Committee, was working with the Justice Department that it would stand up to legal scrutiny. I think part of as well, extending the time period for a sale from 6 months to a year. And again, this is one of the, I think, great ironies, Mitchell, of this debate. The TikTok that we see is prohibited in China. American social media companies like Google and Facebook are prohibited in China. Yet this Chinese-controlled entity still has legal rights in America. They will have a right to bring this to the courts, but I believe this legislation has been drafted appropriately, and I've talked to lots of DOJ lawyers that it will withstand legal scrutiny. And the fact that the Chinese government is trying to say so much that this algorithm is so important, again, makes my case that this is a national security concern. If this was simply a corporate enterprise, then they should let this be sold and declare what a great victory and a great accomplishment of a Chinese tech company. But no, the Chinese government, through its proxies, I think are going to contest it. And I think at the end of the day, the law that was signed last night will stand the test of judicial scrutiny.
Senator, our next question is Tom Fitzgerald with Fox 5.
Senator, along those lines, thanks for doing the call. Beyond judicial scrutiny, a lot of young people looking at this today, Senator, and I happen to be related to a 17-year-old who described this as if America Line was taken away from me 30 years ago. So I was wondering if you could address that generation.
Sure.
What do you say to these influencers, these teenagers, who this has become an integral part not only of their social life, but how, unfortunately for those of us in the newsroom, a lot of them get their news these days. So what do you say?
Well, Tom, I'd say to young people who use TikTok, or anybody who use TikTok, I hear your concerns. I agree there's a lot of creativity. I think it's great that people can make a living as social influencers. But at the end of the day, this entity should be controlled by not the Chinese Communist Party. It should be called, it can be an American company, it can be a British company, it can be a Brazilian company. But the idea that if there wasn't a TikTok and we said to the American public, let's allow 170 million Americans' data to get swiped and scraped, or to put forward a propaganda tool that has more power than Fox News and MSNBC combined, would we say that's in our country's interest? We'd say absolutely not. And clearly China feels that way because they don't even allow American social media companies in. So I think there will be a divestiture. Let me also say that I know some have said, well, what about American social media? I think there ought to be guardrails on American social media companies. If we go back and you look at the level of mental health crises that has advanced so much, a lot of it traces back to 2012 when the smartphones came around and young people and not so young people ended up burying their face in their phone all the day as opposed to interacting with other human beings. I actually hope this bill on TikTok will spur Congress to act in terms of kids' online safety. I think it's outrageous what all social media companies do in terms of kids' online safety. I think we need a privacy bill. I think we need to go ahead and have a fulsome debate on what's called Section 230, which basically gives all of these platforms a get-out-of-jail-free card about any of the content that's posted. And I'd also say, Tom, that we did a pretty crummy job in terms of putting guardrails on social media, and as inappropriate as we were on those areas, my gosh, artificial intelligence is going to have potentially the power of social media times 10 or times 100. If we wait 5 to 10 years to put any guardrails on artificial intelligence, it could make what the social media mental health crisis look tiny in comparison.
Senator, our next question is Alyssa Ranker with Wavy News.
Hi, Senator. You've been a huge champion of this aid package. What will the aid mean for Ukrainians and Ukrainian Americans, and is it the last aid that we'll see going to Ukraine?
Listen, I think we put in place enough assistance here that it'll get through the end of the year. And I think the Ukrainians, this will give them their needed boost. We've never questioned their resolve, their willingness to fight for their country. As President Zelensky of Ukraine has said, just give us the tools and let us do the fighting. And I think we've done that. And I've met with Ukrainian leaders across Virginia. I was at a rally in Richmond near VCU a month or so ago. I met with Ukrainian Americans from Virginia this past week, big Ukrainian American community down in Hampton Roads. I think this shows, and it's not just Ukrainian American communities. Think about the Polish communities, the Latvian communities, the Lithuanian communities. We have a big diaspora from Eastern Europe across Virginia and across our country. Every one of those countries realize that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, their country may be next. And these nations that suffered under communist control post-World War II, I think they know the value of freedom. And I am so proud of the fact that finally, the United States stood by our values last night, stood by fellow democracies, stood by our allies, and said we are going enough to the kind of authoritarianism that Russia, China, Iran, and other nation states, because those nation states are aligned. The fact that China is helping Russia get away from its sanctions, the fact that Iran is providing drones to Russia and Russian aid to Iran, the fact that North Korea continues to be a potential nuclear state and saber rattling. We've got to recognize these enemies of the United States are collaborating. We are stronger as a country when we have alliances as well. And I think we stood by those alliances. And I know I've already started to hear from Ukrainian Virginians today thanking us for what we did.
Senator, our next question is Tyler Englander with WRIC.
Hey, Senator, thanks for doing this. I know that you and Senator Kaine have introduced a bunch of gun violence prevention measures, including Lucia's Law, after that tragedy here in Central Virginia. Given Congress's, inability or, reluctance to pass gun control and gun violence prevention measures, do you think something like this has any chance of actually passing?
Well, we actually thought that, Virginia is kind of in the middle of the political spectrum. And the idea that we would go ahead and put forward on a national basis something that said, let's close the gun show loophole, let's limit to one handgun a month in terms of purchases, let's close the boyfriend loophole. made sense. It didn't go as far as some of the things I actually would like to do in terms of assault weapon ban, but I thought it might be a more moderate position. On Lucia law, which I'm glad Governor Youngkin signed, we had that tragedy in Central Virginia where a caregiver, frankly, should have been aware that they were giving a gun to someone that could be in harm's way. Maybe if Lucia's law had been in place earlier, we could have prevented the enormous tragedy that took place in Newport News a number of months back, where a school teacher was shot. And I think this direction of holding adults responsible when firearms get in hands of minors that shouldn't be in their hands, I think this is starting to be a national movement. We saw the recent court case in Michigan where both parents were convicted by the fact of having their son, who they knew had or should have known had mental health issues, who took an assault weapon and then brutally murdered kids at a school. So I hope, if not the whole Virginia plan package, that the piece of this called Lucia's Law could be brought to the national stage, and Tim and I will do all we can to press it.
Senator, our final question is Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. I wanted to talk a little about your trip to Southwest Virginia, specifically the launch of the Appalachian Center for Hope. I know the fight against opioids and fentanyl is something that you've been active in for a long time. What is your hope for this Center of Hope, and how would the legislation you spoke about at the event help propel the fight forward?
Well, thank you. And again, I should have mentioned at the top, up top, part of this whole national security package that is now signed into law also included an important bill called Fend Off Fentanyl. We've seen fentanyl deaths now outpace opioid, outpace heroin, outpace any other drug in terms of causing deaths, not just in Virginia, but across the country. And what the Fend Off Fentanyl would do is increase the screening at the border. This fentanyl is coming, oftentimes the chemicals provided by China, coming up through Mexico, and we'd have more at the screening points. This is not coming through undocumented individuals coming into a country. This is coming on trucks. We need to shut that down. The Center for Hope in Marion, though, I was proud to be able to bring $650,000 federal dollars to that program. I think the Center for Hope, every family in Virginia has got some level of substance abuse, including my own, in it. We need to realize that the path towards recovery, that recovery should not be a stigma. And that's what the Center of Hope was about. It's taking a former state facility, and it's going to create, I believe, a world-class inpatient recovery center. And many people have to spend weeks and potentially months in recovery in a supervised setting so they can get rid of the scourge of drugs. And two things. One thing that was remarkable, in Smith County, rural county in Southwest Virginia, literally the Community Foundation put up $3 million. That is an enormous commitment from that community. So I was glad to add the federal aid. And I also want to say one of the things that Senator Todd Pillion, state senator in Southwest Virginia, had passed a bill that I was not aware of, but I think it was really important in this notion as we think about recovery and as we think about giving people who are struggling with substance abuse hope. He put a law in that changed the name of drug courts around Virginia to recovery courts. These are courts where a judge works with somebody, oftentimes a substance abuser, and rather than incarcerate that individual, puts them into a recovery program with appropriate supervision. And again, in my mind, what I heard in Marion time and again from the community there was, we want to be about hope. We want to remove the stigma from recovery. And I want to count myself as an ally of that effort, and I was happy to bring federal dollars to that critical program.
Senator, that was our final question.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much.